Irem had a rough start on the Famicom, but all of those growing pains were worth it for this, their masterpiece. One of the single greatest 8-bit action games, Juryoku Soko Metal Storm, or Gravity Armor Metal Storm, or just Metal Storm because the other words are really tiny on the title screen. I'm not going to say Metal Storm's the best game that Irem ever made. I happen to really like In the Hunt, but it's definitely the best Famicom game they made. Metal Storm had a rough trip to the Famicom also. It was actually developed all the way back in 1990. They had it mostly complete, and then Irem shelved it because they decided that they couldn't sell action games in Japan. They dusted it off to fill in a gap in their US release schedule, and they had a very strong response to it there. So they added an introduction, tweaked the graphics a little bit, and 2 years after Metal Storm had been completed, it was finally released on the Famicom. 2 underwhelming sales. It's 1992 and it's a Famicom game after all. But the people who did play it knew it was magical. And as a result, the prices for the Famicom version are fairly high. This is another member of the 10,000 Yen Club, the group of games where a cartridge-only copy will cost you at least 10,000 yen. The plot of Metal Storm is that in the far future, humanity has turned Pluto into a planet-killing death machine, solely for defensive purposes, of course. Anyways, Gigadeath, as Pluto is now called, disappears one day, and then a few days later, Neptune disappears. Turns out the automated planet-killing superweapon is on its way to Earth, and one pilot is sent up in the robot armor Metal Storm to shut it down. When you're initially playing, things seem pretty straightforward. B shoots your gun, A jumps, but Metal Storm has one more trick that makes it extra special. Holding the D-pad in the direction of the ceiling, and then hitting A, causes gravity to flip. Now you're walking on the ceiling, and everything still works the same way. You can flip the gravity mid-jump, but you have to touch the ground before you can do it again. Flipping gravity back and forth is a pretty good trick, but the real power of it becomes apparent after you get a few stages into the game. Because the power to flip gravity let the developer Tamtex make some of the most confusing, mind-bending, outrageous stages that you're going to find on the Famicom. Like here, the level scrolls infinitely up and down. The actual stage is about 1.5 screens tall, and it loops continuously. But here, they flip that on its head, and the platforms continuously loop through barriers that would destroy you, and you'll have to find a path so that you can stay in the middle. Flipping gravity also often changes aspects of the level. It'll cause gates to swing open and shut, and it causes these beams to turn on and off. There are enemies on the stages, but most of the challenge in Metal Storm, at least at first, is just navigating. To deal with the enemies that you encounter, you have a gun, and it will auto-fire as long as you hold down the B button. You can freely aim up and down as well, but not at angles. The default gun is just a pea shooter, and collecting a weapon upgrade will permanently change it. Even if you die, you keep whatever weapon you had before. The only way to go back to the base level is to continue. The S just adds a shield in front of your vehicle. It's actually not a bad option if things are going to be ramming into you, but if you're dealing with multiple enemies, or things that fire unblockable shots, it's not the best choice. So that really makes it the worst option. The P makes your gun shoot a wave. It's got larger bullets, and more importantly, it penetrates most walls. That's really good for dealing with things before they can be a threat to you. It's a good all-around weapon, and probably what you'd want to use if you were learning the game. But the secret best weapon is the G weapon. It looks like it just takes you back to your normal gun, but when you reverse gravity, you turn into a fireball that's indestructible. The fireball will destroy enemies that it passes through as well. What you're really here for, though, is that indestructibility. It's almost necessary to have that once you're in the later half of the game. Other pickups that you'll spot are 1-ups, Bs that are just bonus points, and Cs that will destroy all enemies on the screen. The A's will let your robot take one additional hit, and since without that, any hit will destroy it instantly, that is very useful. Getting destroyed sends you back to the start of the level. There are no checkpoints here. At least they give you infinite continue so you can keep trying. And when you defeat a boss, you get a rather lengthy password, because it also records your weapon and extra lives. Every stage in Metal Storm is broken up in two halves. The first one to introduce the concept of the stage, and then the second one to really push it to its limits. And the stages, other than the first introductory one, are all really tightly focused on a concept. You're locked in a box that's scrolling through enemies. Laser beams turn off and on every few seconds, and you're being chased by lightning as you go through the level. Enemies move on rails, following a path around you. After 2 stages, you'll fight a boss, and most of these aren't too bad if you have the correct weapon. Though it seems like they threw this boss in just to be a brick wall for players. If you can beat 7 stages, then you go back to the beginning of the game and start over again, because the real Metal Storm starts here. You'll begin again on Expert mode with more enemies who fire more attacks at you. And if you survive that gauntlet, then you win the game. While Metal Storm might not have sold well on its initial release, in the years since it's become well known among Famicom fans as one of the shining gems of the system. A game that really shows off what the Famicom could do. Obviously, I think it's brilliant, though I do have a few caveats. The game slows down a lot. And for that reason, the first half of the game, until you get to Expert mode, isn't that difficult. They just don't throw enough at you to provide a significant challenge. Well, I say that, but it can still be pretty difficult to figure out what you need to do and execute it correctly. And sometimes the action can just be a bit unfair, like here where you're trapped in these narrow spaces with enemies that shoot wide beams. But those are all pretty minor complaints compared to just how great it feels to run around as the robot, flipping up and down constantly. You can pull off some really cool moves with it. And all of that makes Metal Storm just a ton of fun.